Inshallah. So let's make a start. In Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah, nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruh. Wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina. May yahdihillahu fala mudilla lahu wa may yudlil fala hadiya lahu. Wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Jazakallah khair, Brother Abdul Haqq and Brother Kamil, for joining us today. So I'll just do a quick introduction to the guests, inshallah, for today. So we have Dr. Abdul Haqq Baker, one of the leaders from the black community of Muslims in UK, inshallah, having loads of experience dealing with the issues with regards to the Muslims in general and with regards to specifically the black Muslims as they relate to specifically the surroundings around about the South London area. With regards to Brother Kamil, mashallah, he has done his master's in Aqidah with specialization in the contemporary atheist issues from Qasim University, and before that he's done his bachelor's in Sharia from Medina University. So he's mashallah joining us from Canada. He's also the resident scholar of Abu Huraira Islamic Center in Toronto, Canada. So this is the introduction to our guests, inshallah. So as we know that, brothers, obviously this issue is not new to anyone anymore. This has been there for the last, obviously, 15, 20 days now, with all the protests around the globe, which is really hampering, you can say, even more so whatever was happening within the COVID situation. But this was something which was obviously necessary as we went along. So, alhamdulillah, I think where we have reached today is that we have reached a pinnacle, and probably apart from 2020 about COVID-19, what it be remembered for, it this year, if we live longer and our children will remember this, for inshallah making a greater change for the black Muslim community wherever it is around the globe, inshallah. So this is where we are. Obviously I'll be quiet most of the time today, and I'll be requesting my brothers to, inshallah, I'll be speaking mostly and I'll start with, inshallah, Dr. Abdul Haqq, basically, to give us kind of, you can say, an overview of where we have reached so far, ever since this murder which took place in the last 3 weeks, and up to today. If you can summarize, brother, in kind of a short 2-3 minutes, 5 minutes to relay to our guests where exactly we are with regards to this episode, and what is happening with regards to now the faith community, particularly the black faith community in London, in UK, in US, in Canada, and how you think this movement is now going to go, which direction this movement is going to take, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Naukhez, Abu Fatima. First of all, alaikum salam. Thanks for having me on. And I want to, while we're doing this, before I get into answering that question specific, as we're proceeding, I want to highlight some of the subtleties we ourselves fall into, even as good brothers, good sisters, families, and everything like that. And I want to make, and so there's going to be some intricacies that I will cover upon as a black Muslim, as an Afro-European, as a proud black Muslim, mashallah, British Muslim at that. And one of the subtleties that I want to address in this instance as well, and it happens with a lot of black Muslims, in that when being introduced or when being addressed or meeting people in particular environments and settings, you'll find the term of endearment is usually what's attached to that individual in recognition that they may be converts, that they come from a particular background. And what is often overlooked is their experiences and their specific qualifications. So I want to bring that up at this point now, because as you're close to me, Brother Naukhez, our families know each other. So in introducing, and I've seen this in other instances as well, an individual with a qualification who is not from a black background will get his accolades and his qualifications highlighted. But many black brothers and sisters don't get that. They're just referred to so far as their activism is concerned. And I think it's very important that we acknowledge that at the initial output for when we are addressing anyone in the future, to acknowledge that they do have particular credentials that are on a par to their peers, of different ethnicities and different cultures. Now, without further ado, I'm going to get into the George Floyd situation. The George Floyd murder, lynching that took place very recently, the day after Eid, has triggered a lot of trauma once again amongst Black communities across the world. And the reason why is because of the brutality and the barbarism that we saw, and also the pleasure that this individual, Chauvin, seemed to derive from that, with his colleagues protecting him by standing around or actually assisting in kneeling and contributing to the death and asphyxiation of George Floyd. That trauma is evident in a number of individuals, including myself, because of our own experiences. Some of us have been subjected to what George went through. We're still alive to tell the tale. In due course, if need be, I can recount a number of occasions from the age of 13 up until adulthood of experiencing similar to what George has experienced. So the feelings are raw. The trauma is raw. We've seen children being interviewed by their parents on social media and crying because they're afraid that their father, their cousin, their brothers are going to be subjected to that when they leave the home. In America, we know it's a well-known and established reality that someone may leave the home and never return. We're seeing so much footage of the treatment, the atrocious treatment of Black individuals. So when you've got other Black individuals from a conservative perspective, like Candace Owens, making outrageous statements to diminish the effect, that what's happened with George Floyd, she has to be countered, because where she's speaking from is a perspective of, I dare say, Uncle Tomism, House Negroism, this assimilation into white culture, so much so that she and others in the UK are tokenistic positions amongst white society, and they are therefore their statements run to the chagrin of the Black community. So there's that taking place, and running parallel with that are a number of individuals, well-being, sincere, well-to-do, who are also thinking they can speak up, and they intend well, they can speak up on this platform on behalf of their co-religionists, on behalf of the Black community. There's a problem in that, because there are certain assumptions that are made by individuals doing that when they don't really have the experience, personal experience, or empathy of what some of the Black community is actually going through or has been subjected to for centuries now. That doesn't mean they cannot speak. That does not mean that non-Blacks cannot speak. But when we now get cliched statements, and this is what's fueling some of the frustration amongst Black communities, amongst Muslim communities, when individuals conflate now all of the other things. Well, what about this Black individual? All lives matter. What about Kashmir? What about Afghanistan? What about the Uyghurs? What about the Rohingyas? This always happens. But when you have an incident where we're talking about the Rohingyas in particular, or we're talking about the Uyghurs in particular, you do not get the Black community coming up and saying, well, what about the suffering of the Black minority Muslims in the DRC, in Africa, or what's happening in Nigeria at Boko Haram, or how the non-Muslim governments are suppressing Islam in Africa, or to the Black people. You never get that conflation from Black communities, Muslim or non-Muslim. But the moment there's a Black issue, you've got individuals diminishing our position, diminishing the importance of that Black cause, that Black issue, by conflating it with everything else. That's an issue that's bubbling up now. And I think when we are speaking about these issues, when we are speaking about what happened to George Floyd, we should not diminish it. And I'll then pass it back to you, Naukhez, very shortly. There's another issue as well. I came to the Islam, alhamdulillah, embraced the deen on the sunnah, love the deen, everything it stands for. But we need to be very, very careful here now, because when we start getting tokenistic statements and references that we all know, Surah Al-Hujra, we were made into tribes and nations to know each other. This is all valid and very well good. The best of you is the one with taqwa. The last sermon of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, an Arab is not better than a non-Arab. All these are like staple ready to throw out to say Islam sees no racism, there's no racism in Islam. Absolutely true. There is no racism in Islam, but racism is alive and kicking amongst the Muslim communities. So when we get non-black members of the community bringing out these stock narrations of hadith and verses of Quran, and then the one that tops that all off is our very, very noble companion. Bilal was a slave, and look at Bilal. And some of you may be thinking, wow, he's really getting in here. Remember, this is Sunday Night Raw. This is why I'm setting the tone for this particular discussion.
No, you go right ahead, bro. This is absolutely raw.
Thank you. Bilal is a noble companion. We're proud, we're honored to know of his status. But there were a multitude of other black Sahaba, okay, as well. Also, this is used as a term of endearment, but also to sanitize and pacify the black Muslims into a particular compartment in that instance. And a lot of it is unintentional. Let's be clear, a lot of it is unintentional. But like white society of America and the UK are waking up to their white privilege. You're hearing a lot of white people saying, we've not realized this. James Corden in tears on TV saying, I'm privileged and I've overlooked all of this. I make an appeal and a request, and actually I insist that the predominant South Asian and Arab majority communities in the West now need to wake up from their cultural privileges and their historic lineage of Islam and realize that black converts and black Muslims in general are saying to you, there's a subconscious inherent racism that pervades these communities, and we need to start talking about that.
I agree, bro. And this is where I would like to bring Jazakallah khair, brother Dr. Baker, and I would like to bring brother Kamil in, really, because, you know, mashallah, he's recently gone back to Canada, and I would like to hear from him, because obviously I've been privy to all the racial overtures from an English context.
Mashallah.
Yeah? But obviously I've not been privy to whatever has been happening in North America, even within the Muslim communities. So this is where I want to bring brother Kamil really to give us a brief as to, you know, what exactly is the situation within the Muslim communities there, you know, what's happening in the masajid, what is happening in the circles of knowledge. If you can give us, you know, a kind of a 2-minute update on exactly what's the situation there.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Abdul Baker, for mentioning these very, very important points. And it's something very, very true. And we as a community, regardless of which background we come from, whether we come from a Desi background or an Arab background, we do need to acknowledge the discrimination and the racism that exists among us. And basically, you know, whatever happens south of the border from us always ends up affecting us, you know, directly. And you know, as soon as protests had started in the U.S., it was only a matter of days before protests also erupted here in Canada, in the major cities. And with regards to our communities, like the Muslim communities and, you know, the circles of knowledge, etc., you know, just like Dr. Abdul Baker pointed out, there is this, you know, awakening, I guess you could say, that, you know, really we do need to sit down and address this issue that exists. I mean, the masjid that I am affiliated with, Abu Huraira, the management is run by Somalis, and even they, you know, just a few days ago when I was with them, even they were mentioning that, you know, even though they have the same skin color as African Americans, but yet among them are those who feel more privileged than African Americans. So, you know, this does exist, and it's something that I think an incident like this that, you know, has taken place unfortunate incident, is it is times like this that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to awaken us. Just like COVID was a wake-up call for us. Likewise, events like this are a wake-up call from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Jazakallah khair, brother. Dr. Baker, I would like to ask you now that basically, from where do you think that the brown and the black communities can come in and invest in this relationship? Yani, moving forward, obviously one thing is for sure, that the Desi community or the Arab community in the West, or even I would say in the Middle East, unfortunately, there has been a problem across the board with the black communities, whichever country you speak about it, whichever part of the globe you speak about. Yeah. So where do you think now we as Desis, as Arabs, should be investing in this relationship? What should be the formulation going forward?
Good question. I think before touching on that, what needs to be done, there needs to be an acknowledgement from where has this insidious disease crept in amongst the Muslim communities. And we have the theological and religious platform and backdrop when we look at the story of Iblis. I'm not talking from that perspective, that's well known. But what we have seen is that from Arab and Desi, I think you're saying culture, Asian culture, is an adoption of a colonial mindset as to what of hierarchical ethnicities in preference. And I think that what we're seeing now is a mirroring of the colonial era, where the Arabs, the Asians, and even, unfortunately, it's plagued some African countries and black people with colorism, where the fairer you are, the higher up you are in the hierarchical structure. And I want to read something briefly that I've touched upon before when we're talking about how whiteness is perceived. And basically, when we're looking, and this is from a white author, white solidarity is the unspoken agreement among whites to protect white advantage and not cause another white person to feel racial discomfort by confronting them when they say or do something racially problematic. Now change the word white solidarity to talk about Arab or Asian solidarity. And then another perspective to look at. It says here, whiteness rests upon a foundational premise. The definition of whites as the norm or standard for human and people of color as a deviation from that norm. Transfer that within Islam now and the treatment of black Muslims by non-black Muslims in predominant cultures in the West, where you'll see that South Asians, particularly, not Arabs necessarily in the West, but South Asians will hold that their culture, their tradition is that foundational premise. And the definition of Islam for them, or being Muslim, is the norm for other Muslims. And that people of color, black in particular, are a deviation from that norm. So you'll get many black Muslims telling you that they've been asked, are you Muslim? How can you be Muslim? They're frowned upon. I've got research here. I've been looking at research here from asianimage.co.uk, dated the 11th of May. And I'm looking here at some of the things data that's here of how can an individual, whether they're black or white, enter a mosque in the UK, in the West. It's a cultural mosque, and they get frowned upon. Individuals have contacted me in the last week or so, telling me they've been attacked after prayer. So coming back to how do we deal with this now? There's got to be an impetus from the predominant communities of cultural and religious awareness. And there cannot be this tacit approval of racist tendencies amongst these communities when they hear it from their parents, when they hear it from their peers, and they instill it into their children. There cannot be that tacit approval and that acceptance of that continuing, because that's the only way that it's being transferred. It's never said in earshot of other cultures or the black community, but it's being instilled and inculcated somewhere else. And we have to ask ourselves, Where is that somewhere else?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And where it is coming from basically is that you can say is the overall inferiority complex, which all other races against whites have, and it's not only the brown or the Arab community which has this mental, let's say, disease. But it's also true for a number of communities which are the subsets within the Asian or the Far Eastern communities, where unfortunately, because of the might and right philosophy of the West, somewhere along the line, the white supremacy has been taken not only from a psychological perspective, but obviously, if you look into the cultural issues, you look at the Hollywood, you look at the music arena, you look at how people look up to the sports, all those areas. Basically, what is happening is that the white supremacy has unfortunately been inculcated in the minds of our youth and our younger generation in a fashion where, until and unless you can say that the parents really work hard to ensure that the Islamic civilization and the Islamic culture, is at a higher level than any of the other cultures or any of the other, you can say, isms, then probably that is an area where it would start coming into the minds of the youth and also the minds of the maybe the imams, etc., and how they're going to be dealing with it. So, Brother Kamil, sorry.
Can I, as you're going to Brother Kamil, can I just add something for Brother Kamil to address? Brother Kamil, one of the key things I think that is lacking in education amongst the Muslims. For example, we know about the story of the first hijrah to Abyssinia. We know about that. We know that the Prophet ﷺ instructed some of the Sahaba to go to Abyssinia, where they'd find the righteous king and someone upon monotheism of Christianity of that time, not the Trinity and concept that we're seeing today. And he said you will be accommodated. They went to a civilization more established than theirs. Islam started spreading on the African continent before it did on the Indo-Pak subcontinent and across Arabia. But this is not taught as a staple diet in Islamiyat. In addition to this, we have stories of, so for example, Bilal ibn Rabah. We know his father was Arab and his mother was Abyssinian. The same Abyssinian society that they did the Hijrah to, which was an established society. But the impression that's given to everyone when they're talking about Bilal was this former slave. And that's where it stopped. When we know that he was somebody of nobility, but that's never discussed. And I say this often as a mantra. For Black people, our history did not start with slavery. It was interrupted by it. So can I ask you, Brother Kamil, what your ideas are on why there's a limitation on discussing Blackness in Islam? We know that Sauda, after Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Khadija radiallahu anha passed, and he did the Haqq with Aisha radiallahu anha in Makkah. It would be another 3 to 4 years before he was with Aisha in Medina, but he spent those 4 years in monogamy with Sauda, who was Black. So my thing is, why are these things not emphasized in this instance? Why are the stories in the Quran not emphasized? Musa and his background and the descriptions of Musa as a Black prophet, as many of them were, of these elements, they're being sidelined, they're being marginalized. The creation of Adam, and you both speak Arabic, and the description of of the composite structure of Adam alayhi salam, and how all the other races and ethnicities emanated from Adam. Why is anything to do with Blackness consigned to lowliness when the picture is contrary throughout Islam?
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. I think the reason for that, to answer that question, is if we were to study the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or even study the stories in the Quran, the stories of the prophets, what we find is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala nor his messenger, I mean, this idea of racial differences was not an issue. It was not, it was not something that among themselves they used to look at one another like, you're different from me. Like the differentiation was always based on, as we know, taqwa and iman and so on and so forth. So, for example, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam entered Mecca for Fath Mecca in the conquest, and after destroying the idols in the Kaaba, he was looking for Bilal, as the story goes, and he called on Bilal, and he asked him to come forward, and he said that I want you to enter with me into the Kaaba to pray, and I don't want anyone else before you to enter. What was the reason for that? The reason obviously is not because of his skin color, but rather because of his sacrifices that he had made for Islam. The Prophet ﷺ said that I remember seeing you in Mecca when you were tortured, when nobody else was tortured for the sake of Allah besides you. So it was because of those sacrifices that the Prophet ﷺ brought him forward. And likewise, the other companions who did so much for Islam, they were put forward regardless of their skin color, regardless of their ethnic background. Now, the same thing, like I said, is with regards to the stories of the prophets. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not highlight, which prophet was black or Asian, or because that's not the point of mentioning these stories. There will be prophets from every race. Allah sent a prophet to every nation, and each prophet spoke the language of their people. بِلِسَانِ قَوْمِهِمْ لِيُبَيِّنَ لَهُمْ. So that proves that there were prophets of Allah from every civilization, every race. This is not an issue. Now, when it comes to the 20th century now, how do we deal with educating our communities about the various personalities, Islamic personalities in our history? I think now perhaps we can emphasize that that so-and-so was of a certain racial background, so-and-so was black, and so on and so forth. But I think we should not go overboard in that sense, that that we make that a thing to dispute over, or to differ over, but rather just to highlight that these were different people from different racial backgrounds, and there was one thing that united them, and there was only that one thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to differentiate human beings based on, and not based on their appearances and their color. Wallahu a'lam.
I think that's important what you said there, and Jazakallah khair, because I agree 100% with what you're saying. It didn't need to be emphasized previously because it was taqwa, and we saw historically, when we look at how the Muslims developed, and who, as you said, it was upon taqwa and upon their merit before Allah that they were elevated or progressed. However, we are in an era where race, ethnicity is at the peak, and we're seeing black people were not always in the positions that they've been in now. We're talking now 400-500 years. Preceding those 400-500 years, this was not taking place in this way. Not to the extent that we've seen the subjugation of an ethnicity, of a people, as we've seen. And we've not seen for so long a sustained, systemic, institutionalized structure, post-colonization, an imperialist system, which whilst the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade has been abolished, there are mechanisms and structures and apparatus in place to keep us in those particular areas. And Naukhez, you mentioned something which was really key, and Jazakallah khair, you touched upon it, that there may be an element of inferiority because of the success of the arena that black personalities fill in sport, in music, in their prowess and everything like that. But then again, that is a paradigm or parameters that have been for black people to allow to excel and succeed in, because we know that we've got doctors, we've got scientists, we've got engineers, but they are given very little attention, because even amongst the Muslim communities, they've placed black personalities into this entertainment sector for themselves, similar to what wider society has done. Sadly, black personalities, black individuals have comfortably slid into those areas because they know that's where they're going to receive favor, attention, and acknowledgement, which is problematical. So I really respect that you've highlighted that that's not a superiority complex as some elevate it and promote it to be. It's actually an inferiority complex. The point that I would say, black communities, we have things that we need to do ourselves as well, but we need to reconnect with a past and have knowledge of a past that is illustrious. That when we go back to the Abyssinian society that did the first hijrah for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his companions, when we see how Islam spread, and we look at the Songhai kingdoms and these kingdoms, Mansa Musa and these individuals, this needs to be promoted by non-black Muslims. The scholarly pursuits and achievements of Africa needs to be promoted by non-black academics and scholars, because we know about India's wealth of Islam and the scholasticism that emanates from there, and that even the Arabs went to India in that instance there. But very little is known about the scholasticism from Africa and how that affected and influenced not only the Muslim world, but the wider world. So I think that needs to be done, and not only non-black communities need to learn about that, black communities need to know about that as well.
Okay, and here I would like to ask Brother Kamil actually another thing here. In your experience, in your mashallah studies in the Saudi universities over a number of years, if you look at the ratio and proportion of the black students coming from various countries, what in your experience has been kind of the ratio proportion there?
You mean the proportion of the students from Africa?
Yeah.
Or?
No, not in Africa in particular. For example, students coming from Canada or US or Britain. Let's say 15 students are admitted in a year. Then how many of them were black, for example?
Yeah, to be honest, that would differ. Every year it would be different. I remember like the year before I went to Medina, or 2 or 3 years before I went to Medina, there was a huge influx of African Americans coming, especially from Philadelphia. So that I remember that was because the university went to the US and went to Philadelphia in particular and had taken applications. So every year it would be different. I'm not sure, does the university do they racially profile who they select or not? To be honest, I never saw that. I did not see that, when they would accept.
I seriously think that, as Brother Dr. Abdul Baker has mentioned, that, the community within these countries specifically, they need to project the students which need to go abroad to study. So they actually then come back, because what we also see is, mashallah, we've seen a lot of black imams, mashallah, coming in, and a lot of black scholars coming in. amongst the community. And there's a long list, mashallah, there's a long list. But still, there is a lot more which is needed to be done. So Dr. Baker, where do you think we can actually inculcate something from an educational perspective within let's say the masajid and the scholarship community within these countries?
I think there needs to be more of a joined up approach from the stronger communities, more predominant communities, because when you look at us as converts, we don't have that family connection traditionally to come back to and support that development. What you'll find is a lot of the students who have come back from Medina and other places, they have to go back in and get 9-to-5 jobs because they don't have an infrastructure in which they can continue that religious instruction that they've learned and to impart to others. Whereas when we look at the personalities in the West, Canada, the US, the UK to an extent, you'll see that many of the prominent du'at and speakers, they have a whole community behind them. And that community continues to support and facilitate their activities full time into proselytizing, into teaching. Black communities don't have that. And I think that if we are going to say we need to increase that impetus, then that support needs to come from non-black.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And in fact, I would second that. I was listening to Imam Zaid Shakir yesterday in one of the programs, where he was mentioning raising close to $500,000 over a number of years through the zakat funds generated from the affluent Muslim communities, which were then spent on the black communities in the US, especially in Dallas area and the kind of wherever he was heavily involved in. So we need to have such initiatives. I seriously think, because mashallah, we have affluent Arab communities, Desi communities, other Asian communities, which need to come together to support, even I would say, even go on to develop some scholarship programs, for the black community members to come and come abroad to study Islam. So how do you think it can, we can make it work? Mashallah, Brother Kamil being there as one of the, resident scholars, and mashallah, you also have so many connections. So what can be done?
There needs to be a concerted effort, I think, and Brother Naukhez, I'll put the ball in your court because you're a great organizer, mashallah. I think that there needs to be a concerted effort. We already have talented graduates in America, particularly, okay? Sheikh Tahir Wyatt, Imam Mufti Munir, these individuals, I think some of them have a support structure around them. But when we look, for example, in the UK, and even just mentioning those individuals, when we look at the black Muslim population in America, it's large, it's quite large. And so having a handful of students and resident scholars like Sheikh Tahir Wyatt is not enough. In the UK, there's a vacuum of leadership there as well, and individuals who can teach as students of knowledge, who have graduated from Medina or have other fields of specialism. So I think there needs to be an active campaign where leaders are identified from within the community, or teachers are identified within the community. And then those teachers, those students of knowledge, come together with the wider communities to say what program can be put in place, how they can be supported. Now, those individuals maybe need to be supported financially initially. When I was chairman of Brixton Mosque, mashallah, we had some donors who were from various communities liking what was happening and what they were investing into the mosque to support others. Not myself, alhamdulillah, as chairman, I was working, but supporting those to go to Medina. We supported 1 or 2 students to go to Medina, and we supported others to be full-time or part-time in this particular field. Once I resigned and came over to Saudi Arabia, that dried up, and that was unfortunate. But that doesn't need to be like that. It can be communities bringing these individuals into their own communities with scholarships and supporting them and wider efforts, including children, schooling, education.
Including children, the Muslim education, the schools, You see, because the other issue I've been foreseeing is that a lot of the zakat which actually is collected, unfortunately, specifically, I'm talking about the Asian communities, they collect all this zakat, millions and millions of dollars, and actually they spend it back home on other projects, in their home countries. So honestly, if we really want to ensure that we have a sustainable scholarship within different Muslim communities, not only Black, but any Muslim communities, then we need to start investing within those countries, within those communities, to ensure that the zakat is actually paid, the sadaqahs are actually paid, the Muslim schools are actually run in a fashion, where actually they are competing with, let's say, the grammar schools, or they are competing with the highest of the highest colleges, which have been, established, overseas. And I would even say that the people seriously need to think about establishing major Islamic universities within those countries as well, because how the world is proceeding, inshallah, we all hope that students can continue to come to the Muslim countries and study. But honestly, I seriously think that the scholarship needs to happen within those communities. And if you really want to have a sustainable infrastructure and a sustainable, you can say, a depth of knowledge within those communities, then there needs to be proper Sharia programs, proper, programs conducted under resident scholars of those communities. What do you think, Brother Kamil?
Yes, of course. There's no doubt. Concentrating on these communities where perhaps these people feel that they are less privileged, or they may be looked at as not welcome or as outsiders. This needs to end, and we need to make more of an effort to to basically reach out to them and focus on them, and to have programs specifically for them, educational programs, obviously, whether it be those who want to go on to study full time to be students of knowledge, or even those who don't want to go abroad to study. To have specific programs for that, without a doubt, it's needed, especially in areas where those Black communities exist, like in large numbers.
But we've got to make sure that in dealing with all of this, that we are not just treating the symptoms. And what is really important is that those structures need to be developed, but we do need to have a cultural shift where, for example, and I use this phrase openly, Blackness and Black excellence needs to be taught. It needs to be taught as a staple part of any curriculum. Why? So a historical perspective can be given that predates slavery. The horrors of slavery need to be addressed in that instance. The attitude, the psychological effect of that are generational, because we have inherited wealth and we have inherited poverty. And that affects Black communities in the West disproportionately. You don't have that amongst Asian communities or Arab communities, because their backdrop is altogether different. That needs to be addressed in that instance. And then also, as I said, Black excellence needs to be taught, and also the religious connotations of Black excellence need to be highlighted, as Imam has said, because we are in an age where that is required. Now, let's think about it. When we look through the annals of Islamic history, when we saw a deterioration in particular aspects of faith, we saw the shirk and worshipping of graves started increasing and things like this. What happened? There was a focus, a concentration, and an elevation on the teachings of Tawheed, which is the fundamental and most important and be-all and end-all of our faith. But there was a concerted drive and effort in that particular instance. When we saw the colonization in India, and there was that drive and a proselytization to get individuals to focus back on the deen and on the sunnah, that was a concentrated focus. Now we are looking at a racism that's so pernicious and destructive that Black people are being killed on the street in broad daylight, okay? And whilst we may not be involved or witnessing that amongst Muslims in a physical sense, there's a psychological enslavement of minds that they are promoting and facilitating. So Black history, not Black history coming once a month. That's just tokenistic. That needs to be instilled across communities unapologetically, unashamedly, and you should have, beside the imams who are teaching that, black teachers to speak about that, so individuals can hear and empathize and really feel the reality of this disease that pervades our societies and our communities.
You're absolutely right, because honestly, the Asian communities don't even feel it, because they are not part of those lynchings. And
Exactly.
honestly, Yani, it's just mind-boggling. If you listen to people like Imam Zaid and obviously others within the Black Muslim communities, then it's odd that what they have suffered. Again, there's so much at play, and there's so many documentaries at play, and again, we don't want to go into the history of Malcolm X and all that, because that is something obviously which is pretty much known. But the problem is that we are not still learning. Yani, within the Asian Arab communities, we are still not learning. We are not still sympathizing with our Black brothers and sisters. And especially here now, I would like to actually come to this racial problem and the racial issue with regards to marriages. This is a serious issue, again, let's say, cross-racial marriages, where parents are not willing to consider Black brothers and sisters for marriages of their daughters, specifically in those communities, even if they are practicing. Yeah, and obviously Islam goes on to detail quite a few things with regards to how what is actually the basis on which the spouse should be selected. But again, brother Kamil, in you've just recently gone back to Canada, so I'm just putting you on the spotlight. But in your experience, again, in my experience, I've seen this not happening. Yeah. So in your experience, again, how do you think that this, Yani, how do you change this now? You've got your hands full.
Yeah. I mean, it's this is no one can hide this issue. It's a problem, whether it be in North America or in the UK or anywhere where we have Black communities and Muslims from those communities, and especially when these Black Muslims are converts. And now it comes time for marriage, and wherever they go, they find the doors are shut in their face. This is a problem that needs to be addressed without a doubt. And I haven't seen personally any such cases, but I've heard a lot of stories. We always hear of such stories happening. So it needs to be addressed without a doubt. And we need to highlight, I think, the examples once again from the Seerah, where we have examples. The famous story of Julaybib, radiallahu anh, and how he was Black, and how the Prophet ﷺ married him to one of the women of Quraysh, coming from a noble lineage. So that's one example of others. So these need to be highlighted, and we need to raise awareness that once again, coming back to the teachings of Islam, what did the Prophet ﷺ teach us regarding marriage? What is the first thing that you have to look at? We need to emphasize these points more, and hopefully, inshallah, I think that is the way forward.
Can I enter? I want to make something clear here as well, though. Black Muslims do not place as a priority marrying Asian women. There isn't this desire, and there's an issue I want to juxtapose here with white culture as well. And this is where the lynchings and the violence was coming towards Black people, even up until today. There was this, there's this stereotype that the Black people desire our women. And if you go back to pre-colonial times, where they would say that the Black people have the Africans had insatiable sexual desires and their organs and all these stereotypical comments and preconceptions that were there. So the white population therefore wanted to protect its fair women. That's one thing. And when they found out or discovered that it was actually their women that also desired these individuals, upon finding that out, they were lynched. Now let's talk about the psychological or social psychological lynching that's done amongst the South Asian and Arab communities when they find that their daughters or their sisters have fallen in love or want to be with a black brother or a black individual. So this is a two-way thing. And I've heard this on social media, like, oh, why do the black people want to marry our daughters? No, we don't. No, we don't. Be clear. We have come into a predominant culture where it's South Asians. The majority in the Americas, Canada, the UK, the Asian community. When I became a Muslim, I didn't interact up until that point with any Asians in my world except one individual who was part of our gang and everything like that. And that's how we started learning more about Islam. I didn't know Asians. We were not interested in Asian women. We had a multiplicity of other cultures, Mediterranean, black, white, brown. And I want to say this again from a point of black pride. Many are happy about their cultures. They cherish their women and everything like that. Be very clear. And I'm not talking to the nihilism and the gangster rap and everything, because that's quite a destructive, disrespectful culture. But black Muslims, converts, and non-converts, we cherish our women, and our women, black women, Muslim women, amongst the most beautiful and outstanding in the world. So I'm making that very clear from a point of black excellence and black beauty, that we are not chasing and this is not for YouTube, but for anyone else listening, we are not in pursuit of your women. We are not here thinking I need to marry myself a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi or Indian wife, and that's going to be my trophy wife. No, that's not the case with any black Muslim. So there is an issue with interracial marriage and everything, but let's put this on equal and proper footing. That's not the be all and end all, and it's a minority issue, a significant one, because of the racism. And the problem is not coming from those who are the recipient of racism. It's from those who are delivering and imparting that racism. We've got to be clear on that, on the societal level, non-Muslim society, and on the Muslim religious level as well.
But do you think, brother, that this is now changing with the coming generations? I do think, alhamdulillah, now with Islam, being practiced across the board in various parts of the globe, alhamdulillah, I think now a lot has been done to tackle this issue. Obviously, a lot still more needs to be done. Yeah, but I think we have come a long way from where we were, let's say 20 years from now. And now if we see it happening, the interracial marriages which are taking place, obviously still a lot more needs to be done. But I do believe things have changed a fair bit. In the last 20 years or so. What do you see? Yani, how do you see this?
I commend our elders who have allowed and agreed. I know some uncles, traditional Pakistani uncles, who have given their daughters to some of my friends, actually. And you should see the closeness and tightness. My ex-in-laws, Pakistani family, and the love that we've got for each other. So yes, a lot has been done, and the younger generations have improved. But there's a different type of racism that is amongst some of them now when they're looking at blacks as black people as their peers and their equals. And I'll give you an example. One of my colleagues who's of mixed background, when with practicing individuals, firm on the deen, and they bring out all of the stock answers against racism and everything like that. But when they're away in the privacy of themselves, and they were with my colleague, they thought he was Arab, and he shared this with me yesterday. And then they started using all the racial slurs against black people and insulting slurs. And they're younger than us. They're younger than all of us here. And then when he said to them, do you know my father's black? The shock and horror on their faces then, and he said, now I see, and he's seen it many times amongst other individuals. So the younger generation are a bit more arrogant with that racism. They may not display it as openly now, but it's still present among them. It needs to be addressed, and it needs to be brought out into the open. We all remember a few years ago, a particular individual, very well known, speaking publicly on the street one Eid, stop acting black. He was saying this to other Muslims, and we don't come from criminal backgrounds, and these racial slurs and connotations in this instance. This is from the younger generation. And what we then saw are other religious individuals, friends of mine as well, coming to his defense and trying to sanitize the extent of what he did. I think you saw the article that I wrote as a result of that. So it's still a pernicious problem, and it needs to be confronted head on. It cannot be skirting around the sides and the edges. It needs to be confronted head on. I think that we're in a moment where that can be done, but we all need to do it together, and there should be zero tolerance at every level of our communities.
Absolutely. Brother Kamil, I would like to, we have just 6 minutes more to go. So, you know, these shows, you know, they're very nice to have, and we can keep on talking for the next 2 hours. It's not an issue, you know, we can continue to discuss various issues. But the bottom line is to educate people, obviously, and especially this show is going to those communities which are not really aware of the issues. They are just reading the headlines in the newspapers, but they're not really understanding what's happening. And yeah, so one is that we want to take this show to those individuals who actually then have an understanding, have the knowledge, be considerate, because you know they might be the ones who are migrating to these countries in times to come, in months or years to come. So they should have an awareness of all these issues, number one. The second thing is that, you know, some of the few takeaways which I would like to really focus on from this particular show, you know, is that for me, honestly, the financial constraint is one of the biggest constraints which is hampering the communities, specifically the Black communities in Europe, in North America, etc. So, you know, my call to action really is that if, brother, through you, Brother Kamil, and again, you know, Brother Abdul Haqq, you know, we can really do something by either, I don't know, arranging sessions, writing papers, writing articles, calling upon these communities, specifically Desi and the Arab communities, to come together and do something about the financial constraints of the Black community. You know, that is, for me, if there is just one takeaway from this show, then for me, honestly, that is the biggest one, because that is something which is an action item, you can say. So what do you, Yani, just your kind of ending comments, 2 minutes each, 4 minutes to go.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with you on that. We need to, you know, contact especially the organizations that have influence, like the big organizations in the Muslim communities, whether it be in North America or in the UK, and also in the Middle East. You know, whatever. You know, we have big charitable organizations in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, and we need to, you know, highlight this, the issue to them. You know, the need for such funds for the Black Muslim community, and like you said, perhaps this is you know, a starting point for that, inshallah ta'ala.
I would add, and I think this is an important conclusion to have. Many may think or frown upon this, like, oh, why do we need to help or whatever. Recognize the inherited poverty that has been institutionalized against Black communities in the West. This is a fact. When slavery was abolished, they compensated the slave owners millions. Zero was given to the freed slaves. 40 acres and a mule in America, for example. There is, I've been looking at research on the papers that I've been writing. There is inherited poverty. We're looking at the coronavirus and who it's disproportionately affected. And they're saying it's a societal issue because of the strata that many Black people are living in with regards to dietary, with regards to regions, locations, localities they're living in, the size of their households and everything. So this is there. And looking at those of us who are out of that bracket and more affluent, we are exceptions and they are exceptions to the rule. So in looking at this, there's got to be an acknowledgement. We need to, it's going to take generations to elevate and bring black communities back to their rightful, or not even back, to their rightful standing as people within society, due to what they've suffered the past 400 years, and the legacy of that continues now, because the infrastructures societally are in place to keep us at those levels. The exception of making it in entertainment and things like this is not something to be looking to and pointing to. None of you will say, when your sons say to you in the Desi community or the Arab community that I want to be a rapper or I want to be a good footballer or a basketball player, I don't think you look at them and say, this is a career that I want you to pursue. You may have a little smile with them and say, as a sideline, why is it that in black communities that becomes a career ambition? Surely the bar's got to be set higher than that, and the recognition has got to be given equal across the board as it's given in other communities.
Inshallah. Any questions from the audience before we, inshallah, call it a day for today, the first show? I'll wait for 10 seconds for any questions to appear. Okay, there have been some comments, but no questions so far. So if from the various feeds, if anyone has a question. Okay, so it seems there is no question. So Jazakallah khair, Brother Abdul Haqq, for your time. Brother Kamil, Jazakallah khair for your time, inshallah. We'll keep on calling you back in other shows. And just for the community of members, inshallah, the next show is going to be at 8 p.m. Saudi time, because this is quite late for some countries where this show is being watched. So they've requested that we kind of do it 1.5 hours earlier. So from the next week, inshallah, we'll be having this show from 8 to 9, and you'll be receiving the promo and the related details about the guest and the subject for the next week, inshallah, by Wednesday. Okay, so Jazakallah khair once again. Remember us in your du'as. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika wa ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi.